All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Uh, Thank you all for joining today's request for qualifications pre-bid conference in connection with Hearts 1, the Langston, and Hearts 2, the Quincy. My name is Asia Bonner, Assistant Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Housing's Asset Management Division. For the first 30 minutes or so of our time, our hour together, I will review some key topics, and then we will leave the second half open for questions from you all. Please note, I will do my best to provide as much information as I can, but I cannot speak for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD uses its bid kits to give all parties the same baseline information. If additional clarifications are needed, HUD will make that information available to all prospective bidders simultaneously with amendments to the bid kit or general announcements. So before we get underway, in case this hasn't happened already, I'll ask someone from the DOH team if they could, or Michael in particular, if you could go over just basic Zoom ground rules here, I suppose.
Sure. Like she said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So go ahead and save those questions. Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself when the time comes. It may ask you to request permission to unmute yourself, in which case just hit that and we can unmute you. And you can use the raise your hand function. The only other thing I'll add is that this is being recorded and will be available afterwards on the DOH website. With that, Asia, I can turn it back over to you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so I'll also note that I am of no relation to the principals of the current ownership firm at Bonner Realty. Just want to make that clear, since we do share a last name. All right, so some of the topics that we'll cover, we'll talk about the current status, sort of current state of play that we're working with. We'll address some large uncertainties in this process. Then I'll talk about the RFQ itself. We'll spend a little time talking about the properties as well, a brief discussion about affordability, the current or the expected status, affordability status going forward, a brief reminder about the timeline for when your proposals are due. We'll also cover DOH's priorities, the submission procedure. We'll give kind of a summary of other things that you can find in the full RFQ. We'll spend a little time talking about HUD's bid kit and potential amendments, debt, due diligence, and then I'll cover what I imagine might be some additional questions about this process, just in the interest of clarification. So with that, like I said, I'm just going to read through this. And then as you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat, as Michael said. And then we'll open it up if you want to audibly state your questions. All right, so with that, let's talk about the current status, current state of play. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has initiated foreclosure proceedings against the current owner of the two developments, Heart 1 and Hearts 2. Should the foreclosure be completed, and in the event that HUD is the highest bidder at the foreclosure sale, the City of Chicago plans to work with HUD on a local government process to acquire the property. This action will be contingent upon approval by the Chicago City Council. The purpose of the city's participation in the ULG process is to identify responsible disposition plans for these developments that preserves affordability and contributes to the overall viability of the developments and the communities they are in. As I said, there is a lot of uncertainty, and I probably don't have to say this myself. You all, I'm sure, are quite cognizant of other things happening at this time. So that, coupled with the fact that the ULG process in and of itself is quite complex, this is sort of a fluid process. So while our goal is to preserve the affordability of these properties with a successful transfer to a local partner, the uncertainty with HUD and a potential government shutdown has required the city to keep all options open as we navigate this evolving situation. The city reserves the right, and this, is stated in the RFQ itself, but it bears repeating. The city reserves the right at any time and in its sole and absolute discretion to reject any or all RFQ submissions or to withdraw from the RFQ process altogether without notice. Though we do say, we may withdraw from the RFQ without notice, our likely recourse will be to post any changes to our participation in this unit of local government sale that necessitates an RFQ process. We would post that on our website in the same location where the RFQ was published. So to talk a little bit more about the RFQ itself, this request for qualifications is being used by the City of Chicago to identify qualified developers with interest in acquiring, rehabilitating, and owning and managing buildings that are included within the 2 rental housing developments that we've discussed. Those properties, again, are Hearts United 1, the Langston, and Hearts United 2, the Quincy. And these are 2 developments on a scattered site rental housing. There's scattered site rental housing in the Bronzeville neighborhood. The 2 developments have a total of 223 units spread across 31 buildings. The buildings range in size from 3 units up to 26 units. Hearts United Phase 1 and 2 each contain public housing units that will retain that designation as part of the disposition. And if you've reviewed the RFQ, you'll see those designations in the Appendix B. A list of property addresses and units that are included in the developments are also attached to the RFQ in Appendix A. Affordability. So again, the public housing restrictions that are affixed to specific units in both developments will remain in effect through the end of the agreements that were established by the Chicago Housing Authority. CHA will have to, confirm, or as a part of your due diligence, you may be able to decipher this in the public records when the endpoints would be reached for each agreement. So let me take a step back for a second and note that there are 2 restrictions that will survive the foreclosure process. Those are the public housing designated units and the restrictions attached to that, as well as the ground lease that 3 parcels contain. And so that is an agreement between CHA and whoever the ultimate owner would be. And in the present case, it's an agreement between CHA and the current owner. And so again, those restrictions would survive the foreclosure proceedings and would terminate at the end of those respective agreements held by the Chicago Housing Authority. In terms of timeline, once again, as you've seen in the RFQ materials, the date to submit your proposals is Friday, October 10th, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. The process that follows submission, as I mentioned before, with the uncertainty is a bit fluid. So should there be any updates to, anything that would follow, again, that would be published most likely on our website where this RFQ is posted. DOH priorities: preservation of affordability, reinvestment and rehab in the developments, as well as identifying a responsible, capable owner to manage these developments going forward and ensuring overall financial health of the developments, again, going forward. So those are our sole objectives in participating in this process and in seeing a resolution to the disposition of these properties, whatever path it may take. In terms of submission procedure for this RFQ process, although under one RFQ, a developer may submit interest in at minimum one entire development or both developments. If submitting qualifications for both, the developer must submit separate proposals for each development. Qualification materials should be submitted digitally to housingam@cityofchicago.org in PDF or similar format. Any files in excess of 15 MB should be sent via download link with necessary access permission granted. Additional information, and this may cover some of the questions you may have, but of course, in the full RFQ, you will find the evaluation criteria, required experience, selection process, submittable requirements, and the affordability restrictions beyond the public housing and ground lease requirements. So now I want to turn and talk about some information that's a bit more germane to HUD and their process, just I think to help clarify a few things. Bid Kits, as I mentioned, Bid Kits is the tool that HUD uses to communicate with the development community about what's happening with the subject properties. And so my understanding is HUD intends to issue at least one amendment to the current Bid Kit in the next few weeks, as there is pending information that needs to be updated, including environmental reports, as well as the time and place of sale. So if you reviewed all 83 pages of each bid kit, you might have noted that that information was not included. And so there is an expectation that HUD would release additional information clarifying those details at a date uncertain at this point in time. To talk about debt as it relates to HUD, HUD will only bid the debt if the city proceeds with the intended unit of local government sale, which is to say if the city, moves through this RFQ process, identifies a winner and advances through the public approval processes. Since the sale is not scheduled until later, and there's not been a firm date scheduled, but because it is a point in the future and interest continues to accrue, when HUD does elect to publish the amount of its bid, it will state as of a given date and subject to adjustments as the sale date approaches. So as interest continues to accrue, they'll give you a date certain, and then you can do your own calculations to determine, what the likely bid of debt would be at the sale. If the city's participation in the ULG changes, HUD would not publish a debt amount. And so you would just, have to come to the foreclosure sale and bid. And then finally, just a reminder about due diligence. With all foreclosure sales, bidders are expected to perform their own due diligence. If you are selected by the city through our RFQ process, you will be required to provide principal profile information that will be run for a scofflaw and child support search. Any outstanding debt will need to be paid in full or on an approved payment plan prior to achieving city council. And now I'm going to go through a couple of pieces that, in case this wasn't clear or you're not familiar with this process, may be helpful information to know. So a lot of times we get asked over the course, the last, 2 years or so that we've been participating in this process to dispose of these properties, the question comes up is, what is a unit of local government sale? And so while HUD has the right to seize and sell a property to the highest bidder, it may also proposition a unit of local government to engage in a negotiated sale. This process is referred to as a ULG sale. The intent of this process is to enable HUD and the unit of local government to, using limited resources, preserve affordability and prevent tenant displacement that might otherwise occur if the property is sold to the highest bidder. In the case of the subject properties, HUD has approached the city of Chicago via the Department of Housing to be the unit of local government. Though a unit of local government through the unit of local government sale, the idea is for HUD to proffer the highest bid for each property, take possession of it, then sell the property to the city for a nominal price. This is all conditioned on city council approval. And if they confer that approval, the city would hold the property for a moment in time before then selling it to the interested buyer, which would be selected through this RFQ process. The disposition sale, the sale from HUD to the city, and the sale from the city to the RFQ winner is expected to happen all on the same day once that date has been determined. So you might have a question in mind of what would happen if the city withdraws from the RFQ process. And this is important to note. If the city does in fact withdraw from this RFQ process, given all the uncertainty that is afoot, the developments, both properties will remain under its current ownership. So the current owners are wholly responsible for these properties and, have all rights and entitlements to these properties up until the HUD foreclosure sale. Because HUD has initiated foreclosure actions, whether the city participates in the RFQ process or not, or in the ULG process with an RFQ selection process embedded in it, whether we move forward or not, HUD's intention is to pursue a foreclosure. And so if the city withdraws, as I said, the developments will remain under current ownership and, until a HUD foreclosure were to happen or something else. So finally, so this is something that was referenced in the RFQ. We wanted to keep the RFQ relatively short and readable. So we did not include too much context about the HUD equity sharing rider. So I'm here as, sort of promised in the RFQ to provide additional context for how that HUD equity sharing rider would be structured. And again, this only applies should the city acquire the properties through the ULG process and then turn it over to the RFQ selected winner. And in that case, then the selected winner would enter into this HUD equity sharing agreement, as I will describe now. So the property deed will have an equity participator rider allowing HUD to recover a limited amount of its investment or loss on the property if the property is sold or refinanced with cash out in less than 30 years. So what would initiate this would be a triggering event. A triggering event would occur leading to an equity review. Triggering events include sales of the property, refinancing, or exchanging membership interests. Once that triggering event occurs, HUD determines the amount of funds, which is also referred to as the proceeds subject to equity, that will be subject to the equity rider. HUD makes this calculation by subtracting allowable deductions from the gross proceeds of the sale refinance. Allowable deductions may include the purchase price for a conveyance, reasonable transaction costs at the outset of the transaction, permitted financing excluding grants, costs of renovation and rehabilitation, excluding routine maintenance or developer fees, and then finally, reasonable transaction costs and financing paid off in the event of a refinancing. HUD calculates the final amount due to HUD by subtracting from the proceeds subject to equity, which was calculated in the previous step, a fixed percentage based on elapsed time since HUD's initial sale to the city. If the triggering event occurs at the following times, the amount due will equal 100% of proceeds if between the date of the deed and 5 years from the date of the deed. So if you sell the property within the first 5 years, you will have to pay back 100% of those proceeds. 75% of proceeds if between 5 years and 1 day and 15 years from the date of the deed, 50% of proceeds of between 15 years and 1 day and 25 years from the date of the deed, 25% of proceeds of between 25 and 1 day and 30 years from the date of the deed, and then 0% of the proceeds of over 30 years. Equity participation rider has a ceiling. So when the sum total of all payments to HUD reaches a certain amount or the 30-year period has expired, no more payments from any future transaction shall be due to HUD. So that is a little bit more description on how the equity sharing rider would be structured. And again, it's conditioned on the city moving forward with this ULG cell. Okay, so that is sort of the baseline information I wanted to cover. I am happy now to open it up to any questions. I'm seeing no questions in the chat. All right. Okay. Well, if there are truly no questions, this will conclude our pre-bid conference overview. As Michael stated up front, this has been recorded and will be published on our website. You're welcome to refer back. The submission deadline is October 10th. However, we will, okay, I think I see from Ron that you'd like to ask a question. Would prevailing wage be required on the renovations? That is a question for HUD. I cannot speak to that.
Could you go over again, it isn't clear to me what happens if the city pulls out, or what HUD does in the likelihood that the city pulls out, or that whole transitional process I got lost in.
Sure, because it is unclear. This is an evolving situation. I'm not sure how things will develop, but as I said, for the city's part, we will publish, we have the right to withdraw without notice, but more than likely we will at least announce on our website where the RFQ was published that we will not continue with the RFQ and this ULG process. And then from there, HUD will proceed with its foreclosure proceedings, but in the interim, the building remains owned and managed by the current owner. Let's see. What happens if HUD is outbid in the foreclosure sale? So this is like any other foreclosure sale. If HUD is outbid, then it goes to the highest bidder. Is the income mix in the RFQ required, or what is suggested? Yes, the income mix established in the RFQ is the baseline. Certainly you can provide deeper affordability, but the starting point is what's been identified in the RFQ. Okay. So I think you're off mute. Did you have any additional questions?
No, I think I'm good. Thanks for all the information. This is helpful.
In other words, if HUD is outbid, the city is no longer involved. Mhm. Yes, I think that's accurate. March 6th date. No, a foreclosure date has not been set. And when a date is set, it would come from HUD. HUD would publish that if and when. Um, if it was in the bid kit, I would be surprised. Um, but for sure, it would be published in the bid kit, whatever the final date is. And I say there's a lot of process steps for the ULG to work out. And so we're not really in a position to determine that date until we would get city council approval. So, and that wouldn't be determined until we make a selection. And that can't be determined until we get environmental report. Like there's, a lot of stepwise processes that given current circumstances, it's not clear that will happen. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, I thank everyone for your time and your interest. And please, as I said, check back on our city's website for updates on our RFQ process. If you have any further questions about the properties in particular, or, the foreclosure proceedings, I would recommend reaching out to the point of contact at HUD. Okay. All right. I appreciate everyone's time. Have a great rest of your day.